Welcome to this podcast on measuring language vitality, an introduction by Laura Haney as the assessment for the seminar Facing the Full English. This podcast starts with an excerpt from the movie The Linguists, followed by an introduction. The main part will deal with the different methods for measuring linguistic vitality. These measurements will then be applied to a specific language, Romansh, in order to give an example. The podcast will end with a brief conclusion and a list of the works cited.
Nước John Hill Mania, nước châm quay nước nữ hồng bạc. Nước nó hồng bạc, TV vậy, tôi sẽ nó hồng bạc, nước không bạc tan hồng bihan nhau, nó cái chung, he knew hồng bạc. So what I just said was my name, and I speak the Chimway language, and I speak it to myself because there's nobody to talk to, and all the elders have passed on, and that's I have to speak to myself. That's it.
The man we just saw is the last speaker of Chemehuevi, a Native American language. When he passes away, so will the language, unless something is done against it. His story is not an isolated incident. All over the world, languages cease to exist because there is no one left to speak them. This type of language death comes gradually, slowly losing its use in domains and the transmission to younger generations, among other factors. In contrast, there is also sudden language death, where the ethno-linguistic community is wiped out, for example, due to natural catastrophes or genocide. This type of language death is usually not very interesting to linguists, since there is no correlation between the use of language and its death. That is, the language dies more or less intact, in contrast to gradual language death. A language has no inherent existence. It only exists as long as it is used in some form or other. If members of an ethno-linguistic community start to use another language rather than their mother tongue, and this leads to the whole community eventually giving up their mother tongue, we call this language shift. The speakers shift from using one language to using another. Consequently, the variety native to this community is lost. A fate experienced by many. About half of the known languages have vanished in the last 500 years. The overall situation today is somber. About 97% of the world's population speak about 4% of the world's languages, and conversely, about 96% of the world's languages are spoken by about 3% of the world's people. This tells us that most languages are spoken by a rather small number of people. Furthermore, specialists expect a great decline in language variety within this century. Exact numbers, however, are difficult to find out. Nettle and Romain write in their book Vanishing Voices, The Extinction of the World's Languages, that approximately half of the world's languages will be extinct by the end of the century, while UNESCO argues that it must be around 90% of the world's languages. Both predictions are based on the fact that ethno-linguistic minorities are shifting to the use of one of the world's major languages, such as Mandarin, English, Spanish, or Arabic. But why do these minority languages lose speakers? Why do these shifts take place? Language endangerment may be the result of external forces such as military, economic, religious, cultural, or educational subjugation. Or it may be caused by internal forces such as a community's negative attitude towards its own language. These internal forces often have their source in the external ones, making the people believe that their language must not be worth retaining. Giles and his colleagues emphasize the importance of the speech community in language loss. They state that in the end, it is the speakers who maintain or abandon languages. For the community itself, the loss of their language means a loss of their original ethnic, and cultural identity. Furthermore, the extinction of each language results in the irrecoverable loss of unique cultural, historical, and ecological knowledge. For us linguists, language diversity is important. On a typological level, for example, we want to find out which structures and functions are possible in human language. The more languages we can analyze, the more we will know about the capacity of human languages. Also, linguistic diversity gives us unique perspectives into the mind because it reveals the many creative ways in which humans organize and categorize their experiences. Therefore, it is important to recognize endangered languages and to assess to which extent they are endangered. Only after this assessment we can decide what to do in order to preserve the languages and the knowledge that would be lost with them. Several attempts have been made at measuring linguistic vitality and categorizing languages accordingly. We shall now take a look at some of the most popular methods in determining the degree of language endangerment. Most of the methods propose a scale of numbers or letters on which a given language is placed according to several factors. The American linguist Michael Krauss, for example, uses the American grading system to classify languages according to degree of viability. Each letter usually corresponds to a label, such as safe, and is determined by certain factors. Note that the labels usually correspond to terms used in the field of biology, where one speaks of endangered species. Krauss scale contains 7 stages, starting with A+, safe, all the languages which cannot be categorized as endangered. Krauss defines those languages as either being spoken by 1 million or more people and/or languages which are firmly supported by the power of a state or regional government, even if the population is well below 1 million. The author adds, however, that there are exceptions to both cases. Irish, for example, enjoys official status in Ireland and is recognized as a minority language in Northern Ireland. However, it still counts as severely endangered. Another example is Quechua, which has over 7 million speakers but is clearly endangered. We have to keep in mind, however, that Quechua is a term used for a number of different varieties rather than one language. Krauss scale continues with A-, or stable. This category includes all languages which cannot be categorized as A+, but are still learned by all children of the community as mother tongue. He further adds the importance of the home as the essential domain. As long as the language use at home remains stable, the language remains stable. The next stage, unstable or partly stable, is labeled with the letter A. This category includes 2 cases. Unstable is where some of the children speak the language, or the children speak the language some of the time. So, for example, a child would speak the language with elders, but not with people in its own age. Partly stable or eroded is the stage determined by regional factors. That is, children all speak the language in one or more parts of the community. In other parts, only some or no children speak it. As definitely endangered, Krauss classifies languages that have passed the crucial threshold of viability. They are no longer learned as mother tongue by children in the home domain. The youngest generation of which all are speakers is the parental generation. Severely endangered languages are spoken by the grandparental generation, but the parents are not able to teach the language to their children, such as most Native American languages. The last speaker of Chemehuevi, who we have heard before, learned his language when it was at this stage. Raised by his grandmother, he was the only person of his generation to learn the language. Where the great-grandparental generation are the youngest speakers, a language is labeled as critically endangered. At this point, there is not much hope left for the language to stay in use. The last category proposed by Krauss is extinct. Here, the language is no longer spoken or even remembered by anyone, so no new documentation can be obtained. Looking at this scale, we can see that the author lays most weight on intergenerational transmission, but he also includes factors such as number of speakers or status. Probably the most widely adopted method to measure linguistic vitality was developed by the late American linguist Joshua Fishman. Like Krauss, he noted that intergenerational transmission was crucial to the viability of a language. He developed a scale with 8 stages, called the GIDS, or Graded Intergenerational Disruption Scale. It is based on the so-called Richter scale, which is used to measure earthquakes. A higher number corresponds to a higher degree of disruption. Other than Krauss, Fishman did not add labels such as safe or endangered, as we will see. Also, note that the author uses the label X-ish for the language in question and X-men for its speakers. We will take only a brief look at this method and elaborate later on the extended GID scale. At stage 1, the language is recognized at least as co-language of its region and is used besides another language in higher levels of education, occupation, government, and media. The language does not have political independence. Stage 2 describes when a language is used in lower governmental services and mass media, but not in the higher spheres of either. When a language has reached Stage 3, it is used in the lower work sphere, which involves interaction with speakers of another language and is located outside of the language community. At Stage 4, the language is used in lower education. The education model for the language in question meets the requirements of compulsory education laws. Languages which are spoken at home, at school, and within the language community are classified within the 5th stage. Up until here, all stages could be classified as stable according to Krauss, since the language is still transmitted to the youngest generation. Stage 6 describes languages which are used informally and transmitted to the youngest generation. Languages in this stage are demographically concentrated and reinforced by institutions. This stage will probably be placed between stable and unstable, since it is unsure whether all children are proficient in the language. The next stage, number 7, includes languages with most users being socially integrated and ethno-linguistically active, but above the age of childbearing. When comparing this category to Krauss scale, we could add the labels definitely endangered or severely endangered, depending on the exact situation. The last stage a language can reach according to Fishman, in which a language might be restabilized, is stage 8. Here, most users of the language are socially isolated older people. The language needs to be reassembled and taught to demographically unconcentrated adults in order to reach stage 7. Again, comparing Fishman's stage 8 to Krauss' method, we would add either the label severely endangered or critically endangered. Fishman does not include languages which are labeled as extinct by Krauss. To conclude, the GID scale focuses on language domains and institutional support in stages 1 to 4, on literacy in stage 5, and intergenerational transmission in stages 6 to 8. As briefly mentioned before, the scale proposed by Fishman was adopted and rearranged to an extended version of the graded intergenerational disruption scale. This task was done in 2010 by the Summer Institute for Linguistics for their online language platform Ethnologue. If you visit a page, you will find for every language listed a number describing the language status. For the GIDS, new levels were added to Fishman's scale, since the model includes some additional factors. Other than Fishman, the authors here used labels similar to the ones used by Krauss. The lowest level of disruption is found on the international level. The few languages which this category is reserved for are used as means of communication in many countries for the purpose of diplomacy and international commerce. Again, this category includes major languages such as English, Mandarin, Arabic, and so on. The next stages, 1 and 2, include languages which are recognized and used by the government at a national or provincial level respectively. The languages are furthermore defined as being used widely in media and the workplace, again, either on a national or provincial level. A language is defined as a means for wider communication if it is used by people outside the language community as a second language and in intergroup communications. Thus, the language is seen as being useful by others than just the members of the ethno-linguistic group. Levels 4 and 5 focus on the support of the language use and its reinforcement through education. On level 4, the language is vigorous, with standardization and literature being sustained through a widespread system of institutionally supported education. Level 5 languages, on the other hand, are used only by some, and this use is not yet widespread or sustainable. Levels 6A, 6B, 7, 6A and 6B all stress the importance of intergenerational transmission. Level 6A describes a language which is used in face-to-face communication by all generations. At 6B, the language in question is losing users and therefore is classified as threatened. Level 7 includes languages which are labeled as shifting. Here, the age of the youngest speakers has risen, since the languages are no longer being transmitted to children. A language is classified as moribund, or level 8A, when the only remaining active users are members of the grandparental generation and older. If these users additionally have little opportunity to speak the language, it is classified as nearly extinct, or 8B. The last level before a language is labeled extinct is dormant. The language might be classified as extinct when looking at the extent of speakers, but it still counts as a marker for identity, and therefore the GIDS differentiate between dormant and extinct. The latter designates languages which are no longer used and no longer associated with ethnic identity. To conclude, being based on Fishman's GIDS scale, the extended GIDS stress the factors of institutional support, domain, and intergenerational transmission. But also, identity seems to be a factor here. Note that number of speakers was not mentioned as a crucial factor in both scales we have just looked at. We will now take a look at a slightly different approach, proposed by Stephen Wurm. In his list of endangered languages of the Western Pacific, Wurm adds after every language the approximate number of existing speakers, as seen in this excerpt. He then adds further information with the aid of two sets of factors. They will be explained in a few seconds. Set A and set B. According to the numbers of speakers and the factor sets, Wurm assigns one of the following labels to each language. Again, the labels correspond to already familiar terms of the field of biology. So OK would be safe, P is potentially endangered, E is endangered, S seriously endangered, and M for moribund. We will now turn to the two sets of factors. Set A encompasses 4 factors. First, the percentage of the ethnic group represented by the remaining speakers. So rather than the absolute number of speakers, Wurm suggests to include as a factor the relation between ethnic group members speaking the language and the members which do not speak it. In areas such as the Western Pacific, it might prove rather easy to differentiate between ethnic groups. In places such as Europe, however, this factor has to be adapted to the situation. Here, one language might be spoken by several ethnic groups. Also, one ethnic group might contain speakers of different languages. But we will come back to this point later in our discussion on Romansh. The next point would be percentage of children to whom the language is passed on, thus intergenerational transmission as seen before. Also here, Wurm suggests a slightly different approach. So far we have seen how languages can be classified according to which generation the youngest speakers belong to. Wurm seems to stress the importance of children learning the language and does not include information on the youngest generation, unless they are the children generation. Rather, his factor focuses on whether or not the language is passed on to children and to which degree. Section C, roles and functions of the language passed on to another language, deals with the factor of domain. As seen before, it is crucial for a language to retain its domains in order for it to be classified as safe. Wurm adds as a last factor for set A the attitudes of the speakers towards their own language. This point has been ignored by the methods we have looked at so far. As pointed out in the introduction for this podcast, it has been stated that it is the language community who in the end decides whether to retain or lose their language. It is not difficult to imagine then that the factor of language attitudes must play a crucial role in linguistic vitality. Apart from that, set A deals with factors generally accepted to play a major role in the viability of language. In his second set, set B, Wurm suggests the importance of research conditions. We will come across a similar idea later when presenting the scale by UNESCO. So, set B provides the following information. Factor A, relationship to a language for which good data are available, is an important factor in cases where more information needs to be obtained on a given language in order for it to be researched. This information can sometimes be found in analyses of related languages. The more closely related the other language is, the more usable information can be applied from that language to the one in question. A well-documented language might have better chances to stay alive. This is why Wurm suggests the next category, the availability of information on the language. Documentation means that further steps can be taken, such as the creation of educational material for the language, in order for it to be preserved, or even restabilized or revitalized. The last factor in set B, fieldwork conditions, mainly concern languages that are not well documented. There it becomes relevant under which conditions the language can be researched. We will now turn to the scale suggested by UNESCO. In March 2003, the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage Unit committed to focus on language as part of cultural heritage. They assembled an ad hoc expert group on endangered languages. In the document Language Vitality and Endangerment, the group listed a set of determining factors on the vitality of a language. UNESCO suggests 6 major evaluative factors of language vitality, none of which should be used alone. These are followed by 2 factors on language attitudes and 1 factor on the urgency of documentations. Most factors have grades, where 0 represents a complete shift to another language and 5 represents vitality of language for that factor. We will have a look now at every single factor. The first factor proposed by UNESCO deals with intergenerational language transmission. All the methods we have looked at so far include this important factor. The scale here strongly resembles the model of Krauss, including the labels. Therefore, we will not go into detail here and continue to the next point, which is absolute number of speakers. As mentioned earlier, Krauss includes this factor in his approach, but emphasizes the relativity of the factor. A language with 1 million speakers is not necessarily safe, and one with a rather small number of speakers is not necessarily endangered. In combination with other factors, this point might shed further light on the situation. In contrast to Wurm's model, here the proportion of speakers within the global population is relevant, rather than the proportion within the ethnic group. One might wonder, however, if this factor renders the absolute number of speakers unnecessary, because what can the absolute number of speakers tell us that this factor cannot? In my opinion, this point makes more sense when understanding proportion of speakers within a nation or territory, rather than on a global scale. UNESCO seems to just suggest both statistics to fall under this category. Factor 4 focuses on where and with whom the language is used, and for what range of topics. The more consistently and persistently the language is used, the more viable the language is. Ideally, a language is used in all domains, thus has universal use. New language domains include, for example, schools, new work environments, new media, including broadcast media and the internet. The more actively the language is used in new domains, the stronger the language is. Ideally, a language is also used in all new domains and thus termed dynamic. Factor 6 deals with the educational domain. In the educational domain, having instruction in the relevant language for the duration of the school day is far preferable to having instruction in a dominant language, with the language in question being taught only in certain classes. The more varieties of materials in the language are used for education, the stronger the language is. Now we turn to the language attitudes, where we have factor 7. It addresses the attitudes of those external to the language community towards the relevant language. Governments and institutions have explicit policies and/or attitudes toward the minority languages as well as the dominant ones. The more positive official attitudes and policies are towards the language of the community, the stronger is the language status. Factor 8 addresses the attitudes of those internal to the language community towards the relevant language. Members of a speech community may see their language as essential to their community and identity, and they promote it. The more positive their attitudes are and more pride they have in language and traditions, the stronger the language is. Now we turn to the final factor, which is measuring the urgency of further documentation. It is closely connected to Wurm's set B, although somewhat less elaborate. The UNESCO model is definitely the most thorough approach, including almost all factors seen in the different methods so far. The authors at UNESCO do, however, stress the importance of all 9 factors to be used together in order to assess language endangerment. They further note that some factors might be more important than others. Overall, the model covers a lot of grounds when it comes to university classifying languages according to viability. Since it seems to cover all methods, we shall not use this model when looking at the example language later on. Now, I will briefly also mention a further model, which differs slightly from the one seen so far. Recognizing the importance of the role of the language community, Giles and his colleagues propose an alternative model. Rather than attempting to measure the vitality of a given language, they suggest to measure the vitality of the ethnolinguistic group speaking the language. They define ethnolinguistic vitality as that which makes a group likely to behave as a distinctive and active entity in intergroup relations. Furthermore, the authors listed a number of variables for this concept, which can be grouped into 3 categories: status, demographic factors, and institutional support and control. Again, we can see similarities in this approach to others. Therefore, I will not go into detail in explaining it and also not mention it later on when we will look at Romansh. Now we should continue to applying the different methods to a specific language and comparing them. Since it has proven to be rather difficult to find all the information needed for a given language, I've decided not to look too far and use as an example a minority language of my home country, Switzerland, Romansh. Romansh is a Romance language spoken in the canton of Grisons. What is important to note about Romansh is that it has several distinct varieties, as do many languages. We will treat it here as one language. I myself do not agree with this approach, but it seems that the methods presented do not differentiate between dialects and languages. Therefore, we shall adapt this idea in order to assess the models in question. As mentioned, Romansh is spoken in the canton of Grisons in Graubünden by approximately 40,200 speakers, and it enjoys official status in Switzerland, both on the federal level together with German, French, and Italian, but also on the cantonal level in Grisons. The area in which Romansh is spoken can be split up into 2. We have on one side villages with a Romansh minority, and on the other side villages with a Romansh majority. As we will see, it is important to differentiate. Villages with a Romansh minority suffer from a lack of Romansh-speaking children. The language seems to be disappearing. On the other hand, in villages with Romansh majority, Romansh medium primary education helps to maintain Romansh among children. In 1996, 95% of the 10 to 14 years old children regularly spoke the language in those villages with a majority. Therefore, I would classify Romansh as A, unstable or eroded, since in some parts of the territory the language is spoken by all children, in others only by some. Since Romansh is an official language on the federal level as well as on the cantonal level in the canton of Grisons, it can be placed at the highest stage of the GIDS scale. In the EGID scale, it is a bit different. The language does not really enjoy international status. Therefore, I would place it somewhere between 1 and 2, or both. It is nationally recognized, but more important on a provincial level, and not so much outside of the canton of Grisons. So I would rather tend to point 2, but included number 1 as well. When we look at Wurm's categories, first we have the percentage of the ethnic group represented by the remaining speakers. Here, I understood it as the percentage of Romansh-speaking people within the Swiss population, which is at the moment, or at least in 2014 when the last census was made, 0.5% of the Swiss population. Therefore, it gets a 1 and is under 10% in Wurm's set A, point A. If we look at the percentage of children to whom the language is passed on, as mentioned before, it is difficult to make clear distinctions. Number 3 would be in the villages where it is the minority language, or where only the minority of the people speak Romansh. But in the villages where the majority speak Romansh, it would be almost 100% of the children to whom it is passed on. Now, this next point is difficult to determine. I would place Romansh, however, somewhere in the middle. Some key roles are retained, while others are lost. We don't really know on which time scale the roles must have been retained or lost for it to be categorized on one of these 4 stages. Therefore, I have not given a specific answer here when we look at Romansh, but I'm sure that not all key roles are retained, and I'm also sure that not all of them have been lost. Now, when looking at the attitudes, apparently Romansh enjoys a very strong support of its own speakers towards their language. They have strong attitudes, and therefore the language gets a 4 in this point. Now we turn to set B. This is a bit less relevant, or not really relevant, because the situation of Romansh is very good when we look at the documentation. It is very well documented, and therefore I will just briefly look at this slide with you. Of course, Romansh is closely related to other Romance languages. It is very well documented. All the different varieties have been documented to a certain degree. But of course, here comes the difficulty of deciding whether where a language stops and when a dialect starts, but we will not go into discussion on this. Now, I would also say that the fieldwork conditions are very good on Romansh. But now, when I calculate set A and set B, how Wurm suggests it, I get a number that shows us that Romansh is actually endangered, although until now it seemed quite safe, at least in the regions where it is the majority language. Now, to briefly conclude this example language Romansh and the classification of it, Krauss classifies it as unstable or eroded because some children speak it and some don't. In the GIDS, it is on stage 1, since it has quite good conditions and a good status. The extended GIDS would probably posit Romansh on stage 1, the national stage, and according to Wurm, the language would be endangered. Thus, the first 3 methods place Romansh quite high on the scale, and give it good chances to survive and to stay stable, while on Wurm's scale it was somewhere in the middle, and therefore we need to pay attention to the development and use of Romansh. Now, what if we look at the population of Switzerland according to main language in the last few centuries? Here we can see that unfortunately the use of Romansh has declined, while the population has increased. Only French and other languages have risen in their use. I believe that these statistics should be included as well in a method determining language viability, since it shows a tendency towards which the language is going. Is it declining or increasing in the number of speakers? But this just as a side note. Well, Romansh is lucky that it has strong attitudes, and that seems to aid the language in retaining its use. Exact measurements are not possible, however, due to regional differences in the language use. Also, the dialect variation makes it difficult for me to really place the language on one of the factors in these scales. Finally, we turn to the conclusion of this podcast. One thing I would like to give you as a take-home message is that language diversity is important in several aspects. Measuring language vitality, however, can be problematic. Each case has to be treated separately, in my opinion. Methods do not always correlate. Nevertheless, there have been several approaches which are very helpful in approximately classifying languages according to linguistic vitality. These approaches might overlap, but also every one of them focuses a bit on a different area, which is very interesting. I would suggest a combination of the different approaches in order to make an exact assessment as possible. Thank you for listening.